Cool. Alrighty. Thanks everybody. Thanks for coming here and attending this webinar on DTA. With us, I have, and sorry, let me I apologize, I didn't do my prep work. I have a little bit of a slide intro for us here. So thanks for coming and sitting down to talk with us about Zero Trust at the DoD. I know we're running a little bit late versus what was scheduled. We had some meeting conflicts a little bit earlier today and had to shift things back. But we're excited to have everybody here to listen and talk and hopefully ask some questions as well. So to start first, we have here with us Nicolas Chaillan, who's the Chief Software Officer of the Air Force. I'll let him kind of go into a little bit more depth, but in particular for us today, one of the big things that he's been doing is helping run this DevSecOps joint program around, which has really been kind of pushing Zero Trust in government for quite a while now. Nick, do you have some you want to kind of start off with to intro for us?
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, so I'm Nick Chaillan, I'm the Chief Software Officer for the Air Force. I'm also the co-lead of the DoD Enterprise DevSecOps Initiative that's pushing the DoD to DevSecOps. And we're trying to really embrace Agile and DevSecOps. And with that comes Zero Trust. So it's a perfect segue to our discussion today. So I'm excited to be sharing with you some of the journey and the different thoughts we have around Zero Trust.
Awesome. I'm glad to have you here today as well. And just a little bit about me, I'm one of the founding engineers here at Tetrate. I was one of the original engineers on the Istio project. I sit on the Istio steering committee, and relevant for today, I actually work very closely with NIST and help develop security standards in this space as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that series towards the end. I think we'll touch on that. But those are some of the relevant security standards for Zero Trust and for implementing secure behavior in any microservice deployment, actually. Alrighty, and most of today, we don't really have too much other than just kind of some open questions, right? And throughout, audience, please do submit questions. We'll be watching those and I'll weave some of those in. But, you know, I wanted us to start with kind of a very basic question, Nick, which is, there's a lot of talk around Zero Trust now, especially in light of things like the executive order for our Fed friends. And it's been kind of a vogue term in industry marketing for a while here, right? But there's a lot more to it than just something like encryption in transit, which is maybe what gets marketed quite a bit. So why don't we kind of start there, which is, what does Zero Trust mean to you, when you start to sit down and think about it?
Yeah, so I guess Zero Trust has evolved. And if you talk to many people now, you're going to find a lot of different implementation reference designs that pretty much look like an end-to-end cyber stack. And it's a little bit confusing to people because effectively to really embrace Zero Trust, you end up having pretty much that end-to-end cyber capability between data, people, ICAM, right? So it's touching every piece of the puzzle. To me, though, what I call really what is the foundation of Zero Trust is kind of two pieces, right? One is the kind of what we call the software-defined parameter concept, came from Google, Beyond Cope, really bringing kind of that, micro-segmentation based on the user identity and the device being used. And a lot of people forget about the device, but I think the device is foundational. You can't just pretend there's no endpoint risk, right? Exactly. That's one piece. And then the second piece is the data-centric security, where you're going to be able to really push that labeling capability down to the data cell level and really be able to do whitelisting of data access based on need to know and different labeling capability, ABAC, right? Attribute-based access control, more advanced than basic role-based access control. So it's obviously denial by default, whitelist, right? Not the blacklist model that's now obsolete. And that's really kind of what I would say the foundation of Zero Trust.
Yeah, and if we guess, let me broaden this a little bit because DevSecOps I think is really interesting to talk about as well, which is maybe a little bit more holistic than just the zero trust element. So do you want to add a little bit more there? Because there's a lot more when it comes to actually like implementing a zero trust architecture in a site, right? There's a lot more than just kind of some of the runtime controls and things that you just talked about, right? And so I do like
Yes.
DevSecOps as kind of that bigger umbrella. So why don't do you mind touching on some of those as well?
Sure.
Because I think that's where a lot of the meat is as well, and a lot of the challenge.
No, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, you don't have to convince me, that's for sure. So DevSecOps effectively, right, it has zero trust as its foundation, but then you add the continuous monitoring behavior, AI/ML driven detection piece and prevention piece. So not only are you going to reduce the attack surface by implementing zero trust, by limiting the lateral movement, whether it's north-south or east-west traffic, right? But also you're going to start monitoring continuously the stack and looking at behavior drift. And if you move to Kubernetes and containers and all that good stuff, you're treating your entire stack as cattle. And that's something very important, I think, to understand for people, meaning, for people that don't know the saying of cattle versus pets, effectively, you kill your stack continuously. You don't give it a name. It's ephemeral. It's moving target defense. So when you're going to combine moving target defense, zero trust, and behavior prevention using AI/ML capabilities and not just the basic CV signature scanning, then you're really talking about an end-to-end cyber stack that implements DevSecOps, of course, in conjunction with a continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline.
Yeah. I really think about it as kind of 4 key pieces, right? Which is that kind of pre-deploy. So the software provenance, how do we get artifacts? How do we build artifacts? How are they deployed? Where are the pipelines there? That set of runtime controls, which is really the meat of ZTA, but, exactly like you talked about, end user authentication and authorization, service to service authentication and authorization that should account for device identity, right? That continuous observability over it. How do we ensure that we're actually in conformance? And then the 4th pillar is maybe that administrative controls over top, right? How does an organization actually use those other 3? And I think yeah.
Yep, makes sense.
So I'm curious, we a lot of the audience today, I think, comes from some of the different government backgrounds. Obviously, you've been working on the DSOP, the joint program around DevSecOps. The executive order has just come down, I guess, maybe a month and a half ago or so. It's been a minute now, mandating zero trust, among other things, across a bunch of different federal agencies. So do you want to talk a little bit about that and maybe how kind of Platform One is there in addressing some of that challenge as well?
Yeah, I guess better late than never, right? I've been pushing zero trust in the government for at least 5 years. And a lot of people thought I was pretty insane for a long time. So I'm glad to see that everybody is now understanding that that's the only way forward. So that's great to see. At the same time, when you take a step back and look at the executive order, there are 2 main components, I would say. One is the zero trust push, and the second one is the software bill of material, which ties back to DevSecOps and projects like TUF and in Toto. I would argue, multi-party signing being really foundational also to that provenance integrity capability. We are implementing it inside of Platform One. And like you said, Platform One is the DoD Enterprise DevSecOps team today. That's not the only one, but it's the one that's approved DoD-wide. And we are providing a lot of different services, including obviously bringing a DevSecOps platform that brings both the zero trust implementation. So we use Istio on the service mesh side. We use AppGate on the ingress egress on top of that to do the software defined parameter implementation as well. And then, when it comes to a bit of material, I think that's going to be interesting to see as well, because, when you look at dependencies of dependencies and trying to understand all the dependencies across open source and COTS software, that's going to be intriguing, particularly when now I would argue the biggest cyber risk that we're facing is probably on the DevSecOps pipeline/platform side, people will try to tamper with your crown jewel through that pipeline, and effectively making that probably part of the crown jewels as well.
Yeah, I agree. We had a couple of different questions have kind of come in about some of the lower level pieces. And so I'm kind of curious, one of the big things you talked on, and we talk about this in the context of SPIFFE on the cloud native side, but I think this kind of gets lost a lot. When it comes to zero trust, device matters a lot. And I imagine for y'all on the military side, device matters like a lot. So can you maybe
Yes.
comment a little bit there? So two kind of related questions are like, what kind of controls exist on devices? And I think that's probably something that's going to vary widely depending on the device. But by the same token, we have a little bit of a more general question around, how do you enforce that device-based access? We can talk about a little bit, and maybe how does that relate to maybe more legacy systems like a VPN?
Yeah, so that's exactly why we created what we call the cloud native access point, which is our ingress egress to our enclave. And it's not just accessing clouds, it's also accessing our bases on-premise environments. And we're doing this at multiple classification level, which makes it much easier. Just kidding, much harder. And so effectively, we are replacing VPNs with MTLS sessions using software-defined parameters, using single packet authorization, SPA, which is part of the SDP specs. We use products like AppGate, but there are other options, of course, that can implement that kind of zero trust ingress enforcement. The beauty there is you get an endpoint client that replaces your VPN client that will be able to effectively run device enforcement scripts at the device layer. And we had to do it on iOS, Android, Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. So we can assess things like, the state of the device in terms of patching, in terms of updates, of course, in terms of endpoint protection being used. Is it one that we approved? Is it one that's updated? And what kind of results is that endpoint protection solutions kind of showing? So there's a lot of enforcement you can do. You can, assign device identities through certificates, X509 certificates. So now you're tracking which device is used by what user. And then, of course, for us, we add a layer of authentication factors. So if you use a CAC, which is a smart card for the DoD, a PIV for the .gov side, a YubiKey, or another type of MFA factor, you can then decide how you trust that user based on the device, the MFA factor being used, and the identity of that user. And then you can add on top of that ABAC, RBAC, such as time of the day, geofencing. So you could say, if you're outside of the US, you can connect, or if you're connecting at 2 a.m., and it's not your usual behavior, maybe you only get to see emails, you can see that fancy PII database, right? Again, just giving stupid example, but you can do that down to the container level in terms of whitelist of the whitelisting aspect of that. So,
yep. No, and I think that gets into a really interesting element, right? And this is, I would suggest, for folks that are looking at doing this in the open source side, there's a lot of kind of prior art here around SPIFFE and the workload API there that's around, how do you trust the environment in which a piece of software is running so that you can issue an identity. Very similar set of principles apply with what Nick just talked about, even getting into stuff like the risk-based assessment, right? Which is some really, really cool area to go into. So one of the big things I think that's interesting to talk about with this group is some of the more organizational side. So less the specific technology, but look, we just talked about, in kind of giving an overview of CTA and DevSecOps, we talked about, like 15 different things, right? From the build pipelines, we talked about paying all the way, up and down device identity, all kinds of different things like that, right? So as an organization, maybe one of the federal agencies that's now being tasked, like because of the executive order, with going and implementing some of this stuff, or, so these more security conscious companies around, how do you suggest kind of getting started? And for some of the teams that are driving this, obviously you have a lot of experience kind of pushing this within, one of the largest organizations in the world. What's maybe some of the advice you can give in how people can go and start to implement and realize some of the benefits of ZTA?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people think you have to get to an end-to-end zero trust architecture to be able to start seeing the benefits. And I don't think that's true, right? You want to start with your crown jewel, obviously. And there are a few pillars you need to think about when you move to zero trust. I think you mentioned one, which is the ICAM, right? Identity management side with both person entity and non-person entity, meaning systems authentication as well. And that's going to be very important to be able to do short-lived and fast rotating certificates to mitigate any kind of cyber issue there. I think when it comes to implementation, you have to be able to go all in with a tech stack that brings the answers you're looking for. Because I think it's I was actually thinking about how do you federate zero trust across organization, and that's very difficult, right? You can federate ICAM, but I would argue when it comes to the policy enforcement side of the house and the rule ABAC concepts, I think it's pretty foolish to think you can do zero trust and then say, oh, but don't worry, I'm going to federate this other organization, meaning I'm going to trust them that they have rules that will make sense for my organization as well. It's just, that's not zero trust the minute you start blindly trusting somebody else. So that's something that people dismiss always, particularly in big organizations. They're going to say, well, everyone can do their own zero trust stack and magically we're going to federate. It's going to just work. It's going to be easy, and it's just not. So I think being all in a single tech stack, automating, right, GitOps, infrastructure as code, no drift, everything as code, right, policy as code enforcement, moving your change management board nonsense from, people in meetings to, change management on Git with, merge requests and multiple set of eyes on approval. That's the way to move fast and mitigate insider threat and kind of mistakes as well. And then you need to find, the tech stack that can do kind of your north-south ingress egress traffic, east-west as well, but also do a good job at device enforcement, what we call comply to connect here in DoD, which is kind of the device enforcement. And then the other side of the house, which is kind of the user and the tying back to the legacy aspect. When you start looking at connecting with a single pane of glass, replacing your VPNs, and not only connecting to clouds, which can do a very good job at software-defined networking and have all these abilities to control the egress traffic and mitigate attack surface on the cloud. What do you do on premise? So we had to bring different tools, partner with Illumio and different companies to look at how do we bring what we call the cloud native access point in a box, CNAP in the box, which is an appliance that you can deploy physically, almost like a reverse proxy, effectively, that will kind of control the access to some of your crown jewel that are sitting on premise that are not, able to get to that software-defined networking natively. So you need to bring that kind of east-west traffic management down to the endpoint layer, and that's a whole set of nightmares when you start dealing with very old legacy systems, particularly when you talk about DoD weapon systems, because you can mess that one up. And so I would argue, if we can do it, I'm pretty sure anyone can.
So somebody actually just asked a question that kind of tees off of that, which are, you mentioned some of the cloud security model and some of the benefits there, right? And part of your effort has been like, how do we take that down? But when you do start dealing with security in cloud, how do you deal with some of the lower level security things? So like, how do you establish that chain of trust, for example, on some of the cloud provider hardware? And then that's even setting aside the whole policy management nightmare side of cloud.
Yeah, I don't think there is a silver bullet just yet, right? I think supply chain risk on the hardware side is more significant than we like to believe. And I think a lot of people like to dismiss it as a conspiracy theory. I can tell you it's probably not a conspiracy theory, and I can tell you the risk is real, both in terms of the laptop you buy, all the way to IoT devices, all the way to CPU chips. I mean, you name it. We have a very, very big risk of supply chain issues, both on the commercial side and inside of the DoD. So when it comes to cloud, I think there are many cloud providers looking at TPM and different ways to provide hardware, encryption mechanisms and different things. But it's always as good as the hardware itself, and what kind of visibility do you really get? And I can tell you, we just don't get enough, right? While we do have a FedRAMP process to get clouds authorized and different things, I can tell you it's more compliance thing than an actual security thing, in my opinion. It's certainly not doing deep dive into that kind of level of detail, particularly when you take into account the pace of IT and how quickly hardware changes. And obviously, we don't have the bandwidth. Would we have the ability to keep up doing these kind of assessments, which is scary, right? Because there is a fine line between we need to move fast and we move at the pace of relevance, and we're not getting behind to other nations, or even if you're on a business side, right, to another company doing business as a competitor to your business. But then moving too fast and effectively the code you write is the next day already hacked and in the hands of somebody else, which I would argue then you're pretty much doing the R&D of your competitors for free, which is pretty cool of you, but probably not something you want to do. So there's a fine line, right? And the issue is we see people overreact to one extreme or the other, right? So they're going to be like, well, we're going to assess every piece of hardware and it's going to take us 7 years, and we're going to have hardware refresh cycle that are going to be 7 years, and that's just not even something you can even entertain in 2021. All the way to we're not going to do anything and just pretend it doesn't exist and put your hand in the sand. I think the answer is there's a middle ground. Honestly, I'm more a software guy, so I have a better understanding of supply chain risk of software. The hardware, in my opinion, is a nightmare, and I don't think we have answers, right?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. It is, and so this is something that varies by site, right? And I think at least for a lot of businesses running on cloud today, it is at least good enough, especially speaking to that chain of trust bootstrapping, right? You can often it's good enough to be able to rely on things like local certificates and similar as a good enough proxy. But yeah, like Nick says, when you really get down into the nuts and bolts of how did that get there, and what does that actually mean? It's hard, and certainly doing it in your own site, right, tends to require even specialized hardware often. In that vein, let me kind of ting off that a little bit. One of the questions was, what OSI model layer does the endpoint agent that we're dealing with operate at? And I'll take a little bit of stab and I'll let you expand, right? And this is something where it's actually pretty important that it doesn't just sit at one layer, as it were, right? So when we talk about that, y'all call it the security sidecar, I believe, right? But more generally, the sidecar pattern with a service mesh proxy, right? That's going to be implementing layer 3 and layer 4 security. Layer 3 policy like IP-based access and similar. Layer 4 with TLS and with identities there from the connection itself. But then you actually have to push all the way up into L7 as well. And this gets into the element of extracting things like end user credentials from the request and authenticating them and authorizing them, right? This is actually something that we're starting to directly address in some of the special publications that are coming out. We'll talk about those in a little bit after. But this is one element that's really important. And, I think, like Nick said, you even want to get beyond just the L7, hey, does this have a credential, an end user credential, and authorize it, but even into runtime vulnerability detection and things like, let me reap workloads, let me kill workloads that look a little fishy at runtime, right? And things like that. So you really want to be able to do that full spectrum from IP layer all the way up into the application.
Yeah,
Anything
I guess
want? Yeah.
you answered the question, but the one thing I would add is when you test solutions out there on the commercial side and you're trying to see if those solutions could be a good fit with your problems. Obviously, layer 7 is the key, right? But what you start also thinking about is simple things like, hey, if I authenticate with my personal device and I take the token that I get from that authentication, can I authenticate with a different device and use the same token? If so, that there is a problem already, in my opinion, right? You should not be able to swap devices and be able to authenticate with the same token. I can tell you most of the allegedly zero trust stack that we see out there that are already nothing more but kind of a mutual TLS, kind of an identity thing. That is not zero trust. That is just not enough. You can't really compare. And a good example for us is, if you use my government laptop versus my personal laptop, there are things I should not be able to do on my personal laptop, and there are things that I can do and things that I can do. And I think it's very important that you can't just swap, the token and then still authenticate. It's simple things like that, but that device enforcement identity check continuously throughout the session, so you can't just swap during the session is critical. And many device enforcement stacks only do it at the connection time one time, and then you could tamper with the device once running, and that's another problem that many solutions are not thinking about as well. So
yeah, you really need to re-authenticate per request ideally, right? Even if it's low level connection things. So one that's maybe a little bit more relevant for some of the gov folks, which is how have you managed, y'all have been building this platform. Obviously it pulls from a bunch of different vendors and a bunch of different kind of best of open source technology. How have y'all dealt with some of the acquisition problems there and just generally getting that stuff into your platform and into the DoD?
Well, obviously, acquisition is a very complex process in the department. We're trying to kind of be more end-to-end, what I call end-to-end agile, instead of a water agile fall acquisition process where we think we're being agile, but we're stuck in time in terms of requirements and expectation of delivery. So effectively, when it comes to staffing the team, I'm staffing my team by buying talent with skills and very clear definition of done, of quality and delivery of the code and the GitOps code and Terraform and all that inside of a government provided DevSecOps environment, right? So now you control quality, you control security through the scans, you have access to the stack, you can replicate it, you can demonstrate it works. So now you're not just buying time that gets wasted by people not doing good work. You're setting the expectation of quality, and you have access to the telemetry to monitor the productivity and the capacity of the team and velocity of the team. And so you buy talents and not requirements, and then you groom your backlog and you can do different things. That's how you then use that team. So my CNAP Cloud Native Access Point team, my Zero Trust team is staffed this way. So now you have capacity of work and I can prioritize different things. And then comes licenses you buy also, right, to of some of these commercial products so you can implement them into the stack. But with decoupling the license and the work, right? So we're not only getting support and services from the companies selling their products. We do also, but we have a separate team that's more objective, I would say, and less biased potentially, right? To a specific product. And so now you have a capacity team, you have licenses you buy. And so we built DevSecOps contract vehicle to buy licenses in bulk so we can order within 30 days and buy licenses in volumes and get discounts for the taxpayer. So we're not wasting taxpayer money. Very important as well. So by combining the two vehicles of the service and the license side, you'll now have an end-to-end agile construct.
Awesome. And let me ask, I know we're short on time. We're just running out. Do you have time for one more or do you need to run?
Yeah, go for it.
Beautiful. Love it.
Even two just for you.
Oh, thank you. I love it. So how do you get the right amount of security? So one of the questions coming in, how do you apply the appropriate flows so you're not over securing things, destroying user experience, wasting money, in particular, as we're looking at like some of the DoD software architecture and security architectures. There's a lot of different moving pieces, right? So in your experience, how have you found like the right, because that is the bane of security, right? Is I lock everything down too much. Look how secure it is and no one can do anything, right? So how have y'all struck that balance?
I don't think there's a magical silver bullet, right? Otherwise, I think whoever comes up with that one will be pretty rich very soon.
Yeah.
And that's probably not me. But what's for sure is that what I like to do is, because I'm a cyber guy, but I'm also a developer, I like to kind of wear my different hats and act as a user. It's funny how sometimes when you're the team securing a stack or providing a service to the enterprise, like Platform One or Cloud One, those same people, if they were in the consumer role, they will now complain about the requirements they defined to begin with, because they would not even accept or tolerate that they would be limited in such a way to do their jobs. So I find it to be always interesting to say, hey, if you really want to know whether or not what you built is a brick and unusable, there's two things. One is you need to act as a real customer, and even to the point where you do your work by using the service. So don't cheat the system, right? So if you're mandating a zero trust thing to do work, then for you as a human to connect to your work, you should use the same thing so you can feel the same pain. I see like people complain, email is a nightmare. We don't use the email stuff because you have to connect to the zero trust enclave to connect to emails. And so I use my personal email stuff or whatever. Well, you're cheating the system. You're not
exactly.
And you're the guy that created the email service. So you really, that's despicable, right? You should never be allowed to do that. You need to feel your own pain, right? And and it's so easy for us, particularly on the leadership side, to wave or do different things. I never want to do that, because if you start letting people have special treatments, then effectively you don't feel the pain. And if you don't feel the pain yourself, you're not going to fix it. And so you're going to compound the problem long term. And as a service provider, you need to remember who the customer is, and you need to provide a decent service. But at the same time, if you just listen to the customer, they're going to probably not care too much about cyber, which is not good. So you need the middle ground there, right? But I would also argue, when you provide enterprise services, you need to see why your customers walk away, meaning, people refuse to use your service. If too many people complain of the same thing, they probably have a point. And if they have a point, you need to learn and listen. And if 50% of your customer, or 20, 30, 40% of your customer are walking away or complaining about the same thing, you need to start doing something about it, right? And then there's a debate between, balance of cyber and user experience. And sometimes, it has to be more stringent. So because guess what? We do nuclear weapon systems. So, it's not the same kind of risk.
It needs
right?
to be a pain in the butt.
Sometimes it has to be. And by the way, think also if it was your kid, or, literally, right? If your kids are at risk, right? You have kids. What would you do to protect them from a hack that could, tamper with a jet, a bomber, or a nuclear missile, whatever, right? And would you do that then? And if you start thinking this way, both as a customer, as a kid that has no power to fix this and is 2, 3 years old and is trusting you to take care of him or her, and then as a service provider, to make sure that the security is baked in and they're day one, right?
Yeah. No, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Empathy is the most important piece here, right? As the security admin, try to build the tooling, empathy around your users and the pain that they have to experience. And easiest way to do that is live it, right?
I think someone is making fun of you because you have not updated your Chrome browser. So
I know, right? Is my Chrome late? It probably is. That's fun.
There's a big update, red blinking button.
Oh yeah, fun.
Right here for you. So.
Oh, good. Well, we'll do that right after. Alrighty, one last one. I'm trying to find maybe the best one for you, or maybe is there anything you want to close with? I know we're a little bit over your time, and we're going to continue a little bit beyond after Nick leaves us, I believe. But Nick, is there anything else you kind of want to close with? Any thoughts, ideas?
Well, I think there was one interesting question, I guess,
Yeah,
I
please.
saw was how to protect the control planes of zero trust architecture.
Yeah,
and
so
what
I
are the
was
key
going to
elements.
tackle this one right after.
Oh, so you're going to take that
but
one? Okay, that's
yeah,
fine.
yeah,
Great.
that's a
Perfect.
beautiful one. We'll talk about that one.
So I'll let you do that.
Yeah.
I guess the other one that was interesting is, does zero trust preclude identity federation then?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great
one. So I don't think it does. I think you can federate ICAM. I think what is very difficult is to federate the policy enforcement point. What defines who gets access to what? I think that's a little bit too easy to say we're just going to federate that magically and it's just going to work. Particularly when you have very different stacks. I think when you start embracing, we're using OPA, right? Open Policy Agent. You talk about SPIFFE Inspire. We talked about TAF and Toto for multi-party signing. When you start piggybacking on, CNCF capabilities and open source projects, I think you have a good chance of not getting locked in to a single product. So it makes it maybe a little bit easier, but it's still a massive lift. I've yet to see, people say you can do it. Sure, you can do everything. You can also disable zero trust if you want. But is it really zero trust if you're just going to federate a third-party zero trust stack and you don't know anything about it, right? Or what do you then mandate and what do you need to know to trust it to some degree, which is then not zero trust because you're trusting a third-party PEP. So there's a lot of interesting things. I would argue it's already hard enough to do it yourself. But if you need to start federating per organization, particularly like if you look at the DoD and the size of DoD and you start doing it per smaller teams, I mean, maybe bigger, like, Navy, Army, Air Force, that's one thing. But if you start saying, well, the Air Force has to be cut into tiny pieces and each of these teams can have a zero trust different stack, I'll say that's a recipe for total disaster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one thing I'll touch on here is that this is actually one of the elements that there's a lot of kind of active and ongoing research in. So some of the stuff around NIST and some of the group there in the cybersecurity division is very interested in some of the federation, how that works with things like NGAC, which is an ABAC. There are some other questions on that I'll touch in a second as well. So it is hard. Right. Just to echo what Nick said, do it yourself first, and then we'll worry about federation later. And that is an area where there is a lot of open kind of how can we author administrative policy that enforces behaviors or controls over all the rest of the policy in the system so that maybe I can start to trust these two stacks, right? And that is an open area. So if you're doing research there, let us know, because that's a fun one where there's a lot of novel kind of things going on.
Oh yeah.
Alrighty, awesome. Well, thank you for taking time. We are going to keep going. You're welcome to stay here and tackle some of the questions if you need to run. Then
I wish I could,
for having.
But thanks so much for having me. It was so much fun. And please, if anyone has questions, check out our website, software.app.mil. We have under the SOP documents, you're going to find a lot. Yeah, right here. You're going to find a lot of great videos, including one on zero trust. So with a full detail of what we do. So thanks for having me, Zach, and good to talk to you as always. Thanks.
Always great to talk. Thanks for taking the time. Alrighty, and then he's gone, but I know that there's still some other questions that are open. I want to take the time and answer those as well. So do keep them coming. The first and foremost, I kind of punted on maybe one of the most interesting ones to me, which is what about the control plane, right? So we talked about some of the runtime elements of zero trust there. And that sidecar proxy, it needs to be enforcing controls. It acts as our PEP, our policy enforcement point. It acts as our audit point and similar. How do we protect that? And this is actually, I think, just a general problem. And right, this idea of in any given infrastructure, there are going to be critical systems, right? Generally speaking, and this is something that we're actually starting to directly address with some of the SPs here. Whoops, sorry, here is, let me stop sharing and let me share you something slightly different. Which is a couple of the different kind of SPs that are in flight. And sorry, this is not exactly the screen that I want to show you, but Zoom is being a little bit difficult for me here. Give me 1 second. There's a couple of different kind of SPs that are in flight or have been written. one of the first ones here is 204A, but 204B actually I'll talk on specifically, which is about using ABAC to govern microservice security in a service mesh. This is one that'll be finalized very soon. Muli is actually here in the chat with us as well. So Muli, thanks. One of the things that this SP in particular touches on is that idea of securing critical systems using the mesh. And the summary is we want to treat those as much like any other system as we can, right? So when it comes to the runtime controls, we ideally want to deploy them in the mesh. We want to be using the same policy enforcement point. We want to be using the same sets of policies to enforce access to these elements, to these systems, because that's just going to make our lives operationally a lot more tractable, right? To have that consistency there. Now, likely you're going to want additional controls over top and additional security, additional scrutiny, additional alerting versus other systems. But by and large, you're going to want to use the sidecar and the service mesh that is enforcing service identity, end user credentials, service authorization, end user authorization for these other kind of trusted systems as well. And this really gets to kind of this key idea, and we discuss it in 204B as well as in 204A, which is the idea that, you know, you have the security kernel. There's always these critical systems you need to secure. Our goal is to minimize the surface area of those systems. The hope is that by leveraging open source software and developing maybe a good catalog of policies, we can start to lock those down and keep them safe. And you know, have that security kernel be better, that is that mesh control plane better understood. But thank you. That's an excellent question. That's exactly what some of the SPs that we're covering on are. How do we start to enforce? Sorry, I'm reading through here. So one of the interesting questions: how do you deal with multiple layers of SDN, right? Or like a software-defined perimeter plus a software-defined network in between? And the answer is today, unfortunately, there's no silver bullets, right? You have to ensure that policy conforms between the two, and there's not good answers. Depending on what specific kind of vendor implementations you might use, that could be easier or harder to do. Today, there's not one kind of simple way. One of the, teeing off that a little bit, and there's a couple of federation questions as well. One of the questions that came in from chat was around kind of ABAC and ABAC design patterns, and how do you start to, you know, it's great we can have, you know, a zero trust system. One of the big tenets we talked about is being able to push down the policy all the way down to resource level to much finer grain. ABAC is a huge piece in enabling that, you know, the fact that ABAC is here in the title of one of these SPs might be a big giveaway there. The simple answer is that ABAC via XACML can be really challenging to author policy, right? So my first, and I'm going to cheat here and answer, you should use NGAC. So NGAC, Next Generation Access Control, is a kind of an emerging access control standard. It actually is an ANSI standard now. It is an ABAC. It is an attribute-based access control system, but it takes a graph interpretation or view of it, and that gives you a bunch of really nice capabilities. Effectively, I like to describe it as, you know, if RBAC is rigid but easily understandable, ABAC has infinite flexibility, but it's impossible to understand. NGAC is a really beautiful, sits right in the middle, where it lets you do the policy that ABAC talks about, but gives you a set of rules or a set of guidelines built into the system, so the policy becomes much more understandable, like RBAC. So a little bit of a lame answer there. The maybe bigger answer for ABAC more generally is, within your organization, you need to define the set of rules that you're going to use. And that's the only way that you can use ABAC effectively. Unfortunately, part of the challenge of realizing ABAC as an access control system is figuring out what the right rules are for policy authorship in my organization. Whew. Yeah, so one of the questions is, you know, we talked about a bunch of different types of policy around, you know, things like time of day email and similar things like that. And the question is, what kind of enterprise metadata or knowledge should organizations be gathering to make that possible? Operationally, can we respond in real time or not, and similar. And unfortunately, these actually have a lot of this stuff has relatively little to do with the service mesh itself, and actually a lot more to do with the access control system that's behind it. The service mesh provides us basically a vehicle for enforcing policy. What metadata we use and what our policy governs over, what the risk engines may be, and the factors that those risk engines use to render a decision, all are going to depend on your site, right? So it's hard to say this in general. A lot of this even gets into business specific if you want it to. This is why I think Nick suggests stuff like using ML, where basically we want to, rather than having to encode a set of rules for what data do we want to gather or not, let's run a bunch of regression over it and see what looks different than normal, and block those as a good first step, right? But you're going to want things like, what addresses do users typically, access the system from? What devices, right? If we want to get down to a device identity, are there normally a specific set of devices that are used and similar? And then, you have the outliers on that you might use in a risk assessment system to deny an access or allow it, right? So another kind of a little bit of a lower question is, we have this notion of a runtime identity, and we're using that for policy. Ideally, we're getting rid of some of our perimeter-based security and instead depending on strictly those identities, those workload identities. If somebody gains access to that, don't they, revocate, don't they just kind of have access to the system? And the answer is yes. This is why, ZTA, it's a lot more than just the runtime controls. That's why, I had Nick talk a little bit about the DevSecOps side and the pipelines that lead into deploy. So one of the first things you need to do is make certain you have control over what code is deployed and not. Then, assuming a malicious workload does get scheduled, yes, this is stuff that we talked a little bit about, the idea of doing runtime anomaly detection or outlier detection or security detection and killing pods or workloads in general that look odd. Even more extreme version of that is just, make sure that every single workload that's running in the entire system is rotated at a very, regular interval, maybe every 24 hours or 20 hours or something like that, right? We do recommend doing that kind of thing in your system. That tends to have some other nice benefits besides, in that more reliable systems, a little bit of churn all the time tends to keep your system more reliable. Alrighty, so I think we're running up on time. Correct me if I'm wrong, other Tetrans here. But I think we're running up on time, so I'll try and get one or two last questions in. I was not related to the dude in the intern. That's a great question. Somebody asked, is the Air Force a Tetrate customer? Yes, they are. We help them with a variety of their Istio stuff and their security posture as well. One of the reasons that Nick and I know each other is because I work with NIST on security standards in this space as well, which obviously has a lot of overlap with what that group is doing. Oh, this is maybe even a better question. We'll run a little bit long because we do still have questions that are coming in and we have folks that are interested. I'm happy to take a little bit of extra time because I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. Sorry, you're getting to look at the here. Let me see if there's something a little bit more interesting I can show you on the slides, at least while we go. But is a ZTA, infrastructure? We've been talking a lot about Kubernetes, a lot about kind of modern deployments and things like that today. Is a zero trust architecture limited to Kubernetes? What do you do with the monoliths? I think that's a phenomenal question. The answer is no, it's absolutely not, right? It's important to note that, Google, I think, maybe gets some of the most credit for defining this term, although it was actually, there's prior art around the term zero trust before even the Google papers. But it's important to note they don't use Kubernetes, right? And so, these first implementations or realizations of a zero trust architecture in the world have not been on CNCF technology, to be honest, right? However, to Nick's point, there's a lot of industry momentum or emphasis behind the cloud native, the CNCF technology stack there. And so if you are looking at achieving a zero trust architecture, it's going to be much easier to achieve today using some of those pieces versus legacy. To put on my Tetrate sales hat, this is exactly one of the key areas that we try and address, which is, hey, all that stuff sounds great, but I have more than just Kubernetes. What do I do with everything else? And so for us, the answer there is bringing the mesh into more environments than just Kubernetes, right? And that gives you the policy enforcement point to have the access, authorization, runtime controls that we talked about as making up ZTA. How do you enforce zero trust or how do you both have zero trust and service continuity, mission continuity for endpoints that need to communicate when you have outages in centralized infrastructure like the ICAM, right? And this is really a general question, right? So what happens if the IAM system dies? What happens if the policy system dies, right? And there's a whole bunch of different techniques that we use at runtime to help mitigate those kinds of transient failures, right? At a certain point, you're just going to have to accept hard down, right? You have to make a trade-off between either a secure system or an available system. I would argue that a system that's not secure is not available, so you can only pick security, right? And so, yeah, at a certain point, when your identity system is down, for example, or your access control system that's rendering verdicts is unavailable, there's a bunch of different tools that we have to mitigate the effect of that outage for users, like caching and similar things. But eventually, you're going to have to go hard down. Because that is the secure default for the system, right? Some of the things like risk-based assessment might make that easier. Although again, if your risk-based assessment engine is offline, it doesn't matter, what it says or not, right? And so this is a general, and this is a little bit related to that kind of control plane security question earlier, which is, for these central systems, they do have to be up and available, they do have to be running, they do have to be secure, and they do often require extra care and feeding because of that. Unfortunately, there's not any magic there, although the service mesh does make it easier to run and operate those things securely. And that's the general thesis of that SP204B, which will be published very soon here. Sorry, I'm just reading through the questions here. There is a question here around the software bill of bill of materials, software bill of materials, as a means of mitigating supply chain risk, right? And that's actually something that's pretty near at hand. The question is there a hardware equivalent to that? Unfortunately, not at this time. I know that there are, kind of a range of different startups that are looking in this space. There's a range of different open source technologies. For example, SPIFFE, SPIFFE, is an open source project under the Cloud Data Computing Foundation, which does attempt to include environment, or more generally just the physical hardware that a workload is running on in its request for identity and similar. So this is an area where there is active work. I don't think that there are off-the-shelf solutions in many cases today. It tends to be, in my experience, it's been bespoke per organization, unfortunately. Things like requiring HSMs or other, attached hardware as a proof, and bootstrapping and basing trust on that, for example. We'll answer just a couple more. I will probably go till 30 after or so, or maybe if we don't have any more questions come in, we'll be able to get to all of them. Which is, what about antivirus in ZTA? And the answer there is, antivirus is just one more component there of that kind of runtime stack. So I will say, in general, when we're talking about production workloads, they should be run in containers with minimal setups or in VMs that are locked down, so that a lot of the general tools and attack vectors that antivirus use are not available, or that a virus might want to attack, or should just not even be available because of the environment that you're running in. But yes, that runtime detection of anomalous behavior, of things that look fishy, of things that look like maybe a virus, for example, is an important part of ZTA. And that feeds into that idea of wanting to do detection on that continuously and in real time, and ideally even reaping, killing workloads that are running things that look fishy. So yeah, antivirus is an important bit there, but I would maybe expand that and more generally say runtime security detection in a variety of different forms, whether that's, things like antivirus, whether that's, stuff like on Linux, auditing syscalls and similar, whatever set of things that is, you do want to have that runtime security assurance beyond just the per request authentication and authorization. How do you get line of sight on zero trust down to the data, down to the level of individual resources? That's a really hard question. And again, really the answer is it depends on your access control system under the hood. And in this context, the mesh and a lot of the runtime controls that make up ZTA are really just kind of there as the enforcement or control points to make sure that, wherever that access control data lives, is getting called, is being consulted, and is rendering verdicts that are being enforced. There's some great questions around kind of quick starts with NGAC and Istio. Will NGAC be on Get Istio at some point? Not quite yet. So there are some different videos and things. Unfortunately, the kind of NGAC runtime itself with a full set of APIs and similar hasn't been open sourced yet. There is the intention to do that down the line. This is something that we're working on NIST with. For example, a set of runtime, like gRPC, for example, APIs that we can start to use with a variety of different NGAC implementations. Those don't exist yet. We are super happy to answer questions around NGAC and how it fits in with Istio and some of the cool stuff you can do if you follow up with us over email as well, just info@tetrate.io. Alrighty, and I think that is all the questions that I am qualified to answer for that have come in. So I'll give takers about 5 seconds here. Alrighty. Yeah, how do you handle long-lived connections? That's another good one. This is actually an area where, again, it's very implementation specific because even what a long-lived connection is tends to vary by site, right? I go and talk with some financial, some payments processors, for example, and the long-lived connection for them means months, right? But I go talk with a different financial tech company, right? Who's not maybe processing user payments like that. And for them, a long-lived connection is 5 minutes, right? So the general idea here is that if you have security that is based on the connection, you want to make sure that you're authenticating and authorizing that you're rendering some verdict on that data at a regular cadence. And so in that context, what we do, what Istio chooses to do, and this is the mesh I worked on, so I can speak here with some authority, what we decided to do is every time the credential is rotated, right, when we get a new certificate for that workload, that runtime identity, what we actually do is we'll drain out or eventually forcefully close the inbound connections to that proxy to force the client to reestablish a connection again, which gives us that opportunity to re-authenticate and reauthorize, right? And so in a normal Istio deployment, for example, by default, you'll see that happening every 45 minutes or so on every individual connection. And for us, that is actually an important part of bounding an attack in space and in time, right? So if you have a credential theft, you want to make sure that it is minimized. So we do that by forcing reconnections with new identities. And then obviously the authorization policy itself bounds the attack in space. The idea is if you steal the credential, you can only talk to what that workload can talk to anyway. Alrighty, and with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all for an excellent set of questions. Hopefully this was valuable. There was one last question. Hey, what's email to get at us? Obviously, if you want to get at Nick and crew, his website there has the information for that. Come see us at Tetrate. Feel free to email us at info@tetrate.io. And we'll get back and happy to answer questions and spend some time talking about this stuff. But with that, I'll go ahead and end it. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time today. I appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.